On August 9, 1978, a razor-thin margin of 9 feet and 93 seconds was all that separated Olympic Airways Flight 411 from an unthinkable tragedy. For those harrowing 3 minutes, 18 crew members and 418 passengers braced themselves. Their lives were hanging in the balance as they faced what could have been one of the worst disasters in aviation history. Flight 411 departed from Ellinikon International Airport in Athens, en route to John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. All systems appeared to be functioning normally until, shortly after liftoff, an engine violently exploded. With this sudden loss of power and thrust, the plane struggled to climb and gain altitude. Instead, it was plummeting straight to the heart of the city. The plane flew dangerously close to rooftops and buildings, breaking several TV antennas in its path, and narrowly escaped collisions with the mountains. To this day, every simulation test of this event has concluded in a disaster, without any exception. It was not a matter of luck, but a testament to the skill and sheer determination of two pilots, Captain Sifis Migadis and co-pilot Konstas Picardos. Their actions and nerves of steel defied the odds and achieved what seemed impossibly out of reach. Captain Sifis Migadis was an ex-military pilot and already had 32 years of experience working for Olympic Airways. His co-pilot, Konstas Picardos, equally skilled and experienced, was also a really close friend of Migadis. So how did Captain Migadis and his crew manage to be the saviors of an entire city? Let's uncover what went wrong and the brilliant maneuvers that turned a near certain disaster into triumph. But before going into that, for more captivating stories of aviation heroism and disasters, where split-second decisions made all the difference, hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon. Stay tuned for insights into the moments that shaped the skies we fly today. Let's discuss the aircraft in question first. The Boeing 747 was introduced as the first jumbo jet ever. It was the star of the early 70s commercial aircraft. The 747-284B was 231 feet long, with a tail towering like a 6-story building. These aircraft meant luxury, class, and practical comfort. The huge accommodation capacity meant that a large number of passengers could travel at lower per-seat costs to the airline. Greece's Olympic Airways bought 747s in 1973 for their non-stop prime routes, including a non-stop flight between Athens and New York. The Flight 411 aircraft was named Zeus by the airlines, a true embodiment of power and prestige. But despite being so popular and in demand, the 747 had a few major flaws. A prominent flaw that also caused troubles for many other airlines was the Pratt & Whitney JT9D7 turbofan engines. The Boeing 747 had 4 JT9D7 engines, and in normal situations, these engines produced around 46,000 pounds of thrust. While these engines were more powerful and boasted a higher maximum takeoff weight, they were notoriously unreliable in certain conditions. The JT9D7 engines had a history of compressor stalls and performance issues, especially at high-power settings during takeoff. Incidents were also reported where the engine fan blades disintegrated due to the engine explosion shortly after takeoff. Such vulnerabilities made these engines susceptible to sudden power loss if not properly maintained or operated under ideal conditions. Several airlines also reported that the engines mostly became overheated in the starting procedures, and that's why most problems occurred during or after takeoff. For Flight 411, these engines were ticking time bombs, and the explosion of one, combined with the challenging weather and mountainous terrain of Athens, made the situation far more perilous. The weather was scorching hot on August 9, 1978, and that was mainly because of how Athens, surrounded by 4 mountains, sits within the Athens Basin. These mountains usually play their role in turning up the heat in the city, and that was exactly the case on that fateful day. The hot and thin air is thought to be a contributing factor in the engine failure. As the engine was already notorious for overheating during liftoff, the weather proved itself as a nudge in the direction of disaster. Flight 411 was operating at maximum takeoff weight. The plane usually weighed 350,000 kilograms, but that day, the weight was around 353,000 kilograms. Now, that takeoff weight doesn't cause much of an issue in a normal situation. But if an engine fails, all that weight, including 160 tons of fuel, can make it hard for the plane to take off, reach the right speed, climb steadily, avoid stalling, and stay at altitude. And all of these things happen with Flight 411. Now let's talk about the crucial mistake that almost sealed the fate of Flight 411, the water injection pump shutdown. During the critical moments after takeoff, engine number 3 had failed, and the crew members knew what was to come. In a desperate attempt to manage the situation, the flight engineer mistakenly turned off the aircraft's water injection pump after he saw the water flow warning and misunderstood it for water run out. This pump played a vital role in cooling the engines and stabilizing thrust, especially during high-power takeoffs in hot weather. Without the water injection, the engines lost significant power and thrust, further decreasing the aircraft's climb rate. This small but disastrous mistake nearly led to a catastrophe, pushing the pilots to the very edge of what was possible. Now let's walk through the events of what actually transpired on that day. Number 1. Engine number 2 had undergone maintenance and was only producing 96% of the available thrust. The aircraft was okayed after a routine examination. Number 2. Shortly before 2 p.m., the plane entered the runway. Everyone took their seats on board and were green signaled for takeoff. Number 3. Just after 2 p.m., Olympic Zeus aircraft 747 started accelerating down the runway 33R. That runway faced right towards the heart of Athens. It passed its V1 speed. Number 4. During the climb, the pilots noticed that the plane was a bit lagging and didn't think much of it. Number 5. Captain Migatis started rotating the aircraft after reaching the rotation speed. Suddenly, a violent failure happened to engine number 3, and it started disintegrating right then and there on the runway. Some parts even fell down on the houses in the departure direction. Number 6. Engine 3 had failed, and engine 2 was already losing power. The plane was now dangerously close to the ground, flying only 12 feet up, compared to the usual cruising altitude of 31,000 to 42,000 feet. At this point, the jet should have been climbing much faster to gain height and speed. Number 7. The high temperatures and high weight were slowing the plane down to a dangerous level. Number 8. 9 seconds had passed since the engine failure, and the flight engineer mistakenly turned the water injection pump off. Number 9. Captain Migatis ordered his co-pilot to retract the landing gear. This was against the rules, as Boeing had specifically instructed not to do that in such situations. Retracting the gear at low altitudes could cause the aircraft to stall, though it was a very tricky decision for both pilots. Number 10. The aircraft miraculously stays airborne, but skims over the city and breaks antennas in its way. It was only 35 feet above the ground. Number 11. The speed had been reduced from 180 knots to 170 knots, and in less than a mile, they would come face to face with 200-foot-high Pawnee Hill. The pilots couldn't risk turning as it required higher speed, and since that wasn't possible, the aircraft would have stalled straight into downtown Athens. Number 12. Captain Migatis decided to slightly pull back on his yoke, sacrificing a few knots of airspeed to gain an altitude of 200 feet or more to pass Pawnee Hill. They barely survived, lifting only 9 feet higher than the hill. Number 13. The terrain got a little lower, so Migatis decided to lose some of the height in order to gain a little speed. Number 14. He dropped the nose of the plane and went from 209 feet to 157 feet. The speed was still stuck at around 164 knots. Number 15. Now the pilots and the engineer were contemplating the crash site. They decided on Agalejo Mountain to reduce the loss of lives and third-party damage. Number 16. They kept flying at lower altitudes. It was so low that they passed the Inter-American Tower, which is a 14-story building. They were actually flying at the same altitude as the building. Number 17. The aircraft had been flying for 90 seconds, and it was passing through the less populated area. Number 18. At 2:05 p.m., the temperature dropped because of the urban density in that area, and a light headwind gave the plane some altitude. Number 19. The flight engineer had been working tirelessly this entire time on the engines to gain more thrust and speed somehow, and suddenly the engines start producing more thrust. Number 20. The speed went back from 160 knots to 180 knots. 21. Captain Migati started to ease back a little bit on his yoke to start climbing. Still, they couldn't gain enough altitude to pass the mountains. 22. The pilots decided to maneuver the plane to the sea to dump the extra fuel. They dumped the fuel for about 30 minutes, which made the plane lose a bit of weight, and they were able to land back at the same Ellinikon Airport. What Captain Migatis and co-pilot Fikardos achieved that day wasn't just extraordinary. It was the triumph of human skill, determination, and courage over the forces of failure. In the face of imminent disaster, they didn't crumble under pressure. Instead, they relied on their training, instincts, and sheer willpower to fight the odds. And they won. Every simulation said it was impossible. The engine failed. The weight was too much. The altitude was dropping fast, and yet 418 passengers and 18 crew members walked away with their lives that day. What do you think about the incredible skills displayed by the pilots? Share your thoughts in the comments below.